As the 20th century dawned, Piedmont was on the eve of a period of explosive growth. The rebirth of Piedmont Springs Park brought a new generation of visitors and future residents to Piedmont. By the time the earthquake struck in 1906, Frank C. Havens and his realty syndicate had developed most of the land northwest of Piedmont Park to Moraga, grading roads, putting in sewers and utilities, and setting out lots for sale. Piedmont was ready to grow. The 1906 earthquake and fire in San Francisco sent a flood of refugees to the East Bay. Many settled in Oakland and Piedmont. Oakland began to annex more land to accommodate the new residents and planned to annex Piedmont. Guided by Hugh Craig, Piedmont filed to incorporate as a city in 1907. After the fire in 1892 that destroyed the Piedmont Springs Hotel, Piedmont Park was too much of a jewel to remain vacant. Frank C. Havens took an immediate interest. Havens, as manager of the Mutual Investment Union, bought the park and planned to develop it to attract visitors and possible residents. Havens began clearing underbrush and thinning trees to allow light to filter into the park's ravine. He augmented the natural trees in the park with exotic palms and hired D. Franklin Oliver to design a new modern clubhouse and park entrance. Havens then built a fence around the park and charged a 10-cent admission for adults, 5 cents for children. Piedmont Springs Park officially opened on May 7, 1898, as a fundraiser for the Ladies' Relief Society. That evening, hundreds of small twinkling lights in the trees created a fantasy parkland for party-goers. Only the clubhouse and the mineral springs grottos were built at the time. The springs once again offered mineral water to the health-seeking or curious. The beauty of the wooded ravine, the cascading water, bucolic pathways, rustic bridges, and exotic plantings were the park attractions. The Piedmont Springs Clubhouse had a spacious dining room filled with potted palms. White linen tablecloths provided an air of sophistication. Large windows looked out to the newly restored and elegant park. An adjacent dining room, also overlooking the lush park, had an open veranda for fresh air dining. The clubhouse served the finest food available. It soon became a popular dining spot for residents and visitors alike. The gently sloping stairs from the clubhouse beckoned diners out into the park. Frank Havens had transformed the former Piedmont Springs Park into an elegant Victorian strolling park, adding, over time, several amusements and diversions for those who followed the park paths. Just east of the clubhouse, Havens built a rustic Victorian tea house. Stick work formed the railings, posts, and roof of this first tea house. Thatch and later vines covered the roof, providing shade. Victorians loved exotic plants, and throughout the park, Havens planted queen palms, Canary Island date palms, cordyline trees, also known as cabbage palms, and other exotics, such as banana trees, grew in the ravine. At one time or another, the park had parterres of exotic canna and orchids, a rose garden, and a lily pond and fountain. A second rustic gazebo served as a bandstand, built where the overlook is today. Musicians played every Sunday, and their music drifted throughout the park. Benches lined the path in the upper park, offering a place of rest for visitors to enjoy the music. In keeping with the Victorian interest in the exotic, Havens soon brought a Japanese tea house to Piedmont Park, built where the present tea house stands today. A Japanese gate led to the gardens with ponds and bridges. Stickwork fences and pillars complemented these Japanese grounds. Havens also enhanced the park's original mineral springs. Calling on the Victorian fondness for rock follies, he built concrete and wire follies at the two springs. A cup near the spring once again allowed the health-seeking or curious to take the waters, as they did in the 1870s. Today, Haven's upper grotto is still visible in the amphitheater below the community center. As park visitors meandered down the park paths, there were still more diversions. Rustic bridges crisscrossed the creek, offering a myriad of paths throughout the park. An old oak tree supported steps and platforms with seating and beckoned the adventurous to climb up for an exceptional view of the creek, trees, and lush grounds. At one point, the creek tumbled down a 10-foot waterfall. This cascade was lined with tropical plants, enhancing the exotic nature of the park. As visitors continued down into the park, passing the lower spring and its concrete folly, they came upon Haven's grandest amusement, the maze. In 1904, Haven's gardeners planted a large circular hedge maze in the natural bowl where Witter Field stands today. This privet maze challenged all who entered to reach the bright red Japanese pagoda at the center. Ladders, strategically placed throughout the maze, allowed those feeling hopelessly lost to get their bearings. The maze was a double challenge. Finding one's way out was as challenging as finding one's way in. Beyond the maze was a palm-lined road down to today's Grand Avenue and the local streetcar. Today, the palm trees on Palm Drive, lining this former exit of the park, are a stately reminder of the palms that grew in Piedmont Park. Frank Havens continually added to the park. In 1908, he built his Piedmont Art Gallery on the site of today's park tennis courts. The large, skylit gallery held Havens' own collection of works of art by English, French, Russian, and American painters. Later, Havens' art collection was sold, and many paintings went to the De Young Museum in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park. Records show that Havens also purchased several paintings from Piedmont artist Xavier Martinez. Since the Martinez paintings were not listed on the gallery inventory, Havens presumably hung these pieces in his home. The Piedmont Clubhouse was a popular meeting place for the Ruskin Club, a group of artists and journalists sympathetic to John Ruskin's ideals. Jack London was one of several Piedmont bohemians who dined with the Ruskin Club. Up in the hills, away from the traffic on Vernal Avenue and the visitors to Piedmont Park, a small but lively coterie of artists and writers lived near Scenic Avenue. In 1903, Jack London and his wife Bessie rented Joseph Worcester's cottage in the Piedmont Hills. Xavier Martinez and Herman Whitaker lived up the street, and George Sterling was just across the way on Oakland Avenue. Although London lived only briefly in Piedmont, he wrote Call of the Wild and began writing The Sea Wolf here, his most famous stories. Gregarious Jack London became the social center of these bohemians. Biographies of London tell of gatherings on Sunday afternoons, picnicking in the hills, reading each other's latest compositions, gossiping about each other's infidelities, and frolicking beneath the cherry boughs in the hills of Piedmont. Calling themselves the Crowd, they also gathered on Wednesday nights at Jack London's cottage for dinner and drinking. At any time, the crowd might include poet George Sterling and his wife Carrie, poet Joaquin Miller, author Ambrose Bierce, writer Herman Jim Whitaker, artist Xavier Martinez, artist Richard Partington and his wife Blanche, photographer Arnold Genthy, journalist Joseph Noel, and several women fond of Jack London, including Anna Strunsky and Charmaine Etheridge. Peace and tranquility in the Piedmont Hills ended early on the morning of April 18, 1906, when San Franciscans were jolted from their beds by a tremendous earthquake. The fires that followed left thousands of San Franciscans homeless. East Bay cities sustained some damage during the earthquake, but not as extensive as that in San Francisco. As the fires continued, many of the refugees who fled to the East Bay thought San Francisco was finished. They made Oakland and Piedmont their new home. Piedmont's population increased from 634 in 1890 to an estimated 1,000 in 1907 and 1,719 in 1910. According to the U.S. Census, Oakland's population jumped from 67,000 in 1900 to 150,000 in 1910. To accommodate these new residents, Oakland had begun to annex more land. Claremont, Fruitvale, Leona Heights, Melrose, Fitchburg, and Elmhurst. Piedmont was also on that list to be annexed to Oakland. Oakland Mayor Mott spoke to the Piedmont residents, extolling the advantages of becoming part of Oakland. He promised better sewers and roads, improved water supply, and police and fire protection. Oakland politicians thought that annexing the beauty of the Piedmont Hills would be a great asset for Oakland. Taxes on Piedmont's land would swell the Oakland coffers. As Oakland looked to the hills to annex more land, a group of far-sighted Piedmont residents began to move toward incorporating Piedmont as a city. In a race of annexation versus incorporation, Piedmonters had to move quickly. In order to incorporate, the city had to have boundaries. With no time for a survey, Piedmont leaders accepted the eastern edge of Oakland as the western boundary of Piedmont, and the southern edge of the 1897 Oakland Annex as the northern boundary of Piedmont. The south and east boundaries of the already existing Piedmont Sanitary District completed Piedmont's boundaries. On January 7, 1907, Hugh Craig and James Ballantine filed a map of Piedmont in Sacramento, paving the way for a vote of incorporation. Piedmonters voted on Saturday, January 26, 1907, to incorporate as a municipality and elected a board of trustees to govern the city. The Oakland Tribune reported that 117 votes were cast. 79 Piedmonters voted for incorporation and 38 voted against. James Ballantine became Piedmont's first city clerk. Frank McHenry became treasurer, and Joseph Furtado became marshal. 5 trustees were elected: George Armstrong, Henry Butters, Hugh Craig, Varney Caskill, and Miles Standish. 2 weeks later, at their first meeting, the Board of Trustees surprisingly elected Varney Caskill as president of the Board of Trustees over Hugh Craig, who had led the movement towards incorporation. On January 30th, 1907, the state of California signed the documents making Piedmont an official municipal corporation. Piedmont's population was estimated at 1,000 at the time it became a city. By 1910, Oakland annexed 44 square miles of land, all the remaining land around Piedmont, preventing any expansion of Piedmont as a city and making Piedmont a city completely surrounded by another city.